Hello, this is Paul Davis with the first of a possible irregular series of discussions between myself and other audio software developers. We begin with a conversation with Justin Frankel, the lead developer of the digital audio workstation Reaper. Justin and I briefly crossed paths when he first started working on Reaper, and I had already spent a few years working on Ardour, my own digital audio workstation. Since then we've never spoken, but there are many similarities and quite a few differences in the paths that we've both followed for many years now. At the beginning of 2022, we both sat down and talked for several hours about a wide variety of topics that relate to the history and future of both of our DAWs. A warning for those who don't write software for a living. This conversation, like any others that may happen here in the future, is between two people who understand at great depth what they both do. We haven't tried to explain concepts or terminology to make things more accessible for a wider audience. Although we rarely talk in terms of actual lines of code, this is a free-flowing chat between two audio software developers. It's a conversation about things that we find interesting in the other's work, rather than an introduction to it for those who are less familiar. Nevertheless, I hope that some of you enjoyed the long chat that Justin and I had, and may have suggestions for future conversations in this series. A quick note, this is a somewhat edited version of our original conversation. And then I thought, maybe it would just be interesting to actually have two guys that write DAWs actually just talk about this stuff.
Yeah, actually what it might be, though, what I think is the more interesting thing is not the fact that the technical side, it's the fact that we've both been working on the same similar pieces of software for 16 plus years, which is always just kind of blows me away because it's a long time, and to just work on anything for that amount of time is
and it's also the other thing that there's an interesting similarity and contrast to here. I don't really know what word I would use to describe my relationship with Gerhard Bales, one of the founders of Ableton. But on the occasion, I very rarely see him, but on the occasions when I have, we've spent a long time, hanging out. We've been the first into a restaurant and the last out, and I know it's been a lot of fun. But he started working on Live pretty much exactly the same time I started working on Ardour in '99, and look at him go. Right? It's a totally different path that he's gone down. In the sense of actually starting a company that's just kind of grown and grown. And I found it quite interesting chatting with him about his experience of that, because, certainly for the first few years, I think he was very happy being actually writing code. And then things kind of started exploding, and he wasn't really writing code so much anymore. He was managing a company and thinking about vision and all that kind of stuff. And it seems to me that with both Reaper and Ardour, that the people who started it have pretty much just, when we both stayed with our fingers stuck in the pie.
Yeah, well, that's the fun part. I mean, running a company can be interesting, but if you get too far away from the soul of it, then what are you doing? For me, at least.
It's certainly not something that I would like to do.
Nor I. Yes,
that's for sure. And I was struck by your answers to Vin when you were talking about. I think he was asking something about how do you decide what you're going to be working on, and you basically said, well, we just do whatever's fun and what we want to do right now. And I thought that just sounds very familiar. So yeah, I just thought maybe it would be worth trying to chat about the stuff in general and some specifics that I'm intrigued by, and I think maybe some other people might be intrigued by as well, depending on how the conversation goes and so on. So, I mean, I guess one of the first things that struck me when I was thinking about, some of the similarities and the differences between the two pathways that we've been on, are that, as far as I'm aware, both of us started working on a digital audio workstation without, I shouldn't even go so far as to say it wasn't a goal, but there wasn't a necessity of doing it as a way of making money. Is that a correct assessment of the history of Reaper?
I mean, I started making Reaper because I got into recording music, and the other options didn't really do it for me. So what was your
Yeah, I think.
this.
I mean, I wasn't recording music at that point. I was thinking about trying to do so, and the options that were available on Linux at that point weren't viable in any way. And for various reasons, I had a fairly strong commitment to using Linux, and I just thought, how hard can it be? Famous last words. Although, I mean, there is a famous story I've told previously. I actually did call Digi and asked them if I could just port Pro Tools to Linux for them. That conversation didn't go terribly well. But I did have the goal at that point of using whatever I wrote to record music myself. In my case, I think I realized after a relatively short period of time that I'm a much better programmer than I am a musician.
I'm familiar with that feeling as well. And I like to think it's because I'm a really good musician, but no, it's... yeah.
But so, I mean, was it, for you, did it start purely with the idea of it being a personal tool, or were you starting out thinking, oh, I'm actually going to write like a tool that lots of people could use?
Well, I mean, it's sort of in the middle because, I had no, I had experience making things for myself and then other people using them. So it was both. It was make something for myself and, maybe some other people want to use it, but not necessarily everybody. And, and obviously everyone uses all sorts of different things. But yeah, it was very much for personal use, but also with, an eye of making it usable by others because, that would be, it's better to make some, if you're going to go through the trouble of making a DAW, you might as well make it usable for other people too.
Do you recall at what point along the way you began to think about it in more as a commercial product than as a sort of hobby project that might turn out to be nice?
I think it was never out of the realm of possibility. It was more that initially, after I left AOL in 2003, I started a company, and just as a sort of container for whatever projects I would do, which, wasn't really necessary, but at the same time, it seemed like a good idea. The society as a general sort of encourages that because, you can't write off things for hobbies and stuff like that. But if you have a business, and you can't write off things indefinitely for businesses, but, if you have a business, then, there's a certain legitimacy and people go, oh, well, that makes sense, even if you're not necessarily successful. So I started a very poorly named business, and then had a couple of projects that, including Ninjam, which were interesting, but also like you look at and you're like, yeah, clearly this is not a business that is going to be worth treating as a business. And so, but then I guess, pretty early on, once Reaper started getting a little bit of use, and you said, how hard could it be? Well, turns out writing a DAW is not that hard. But to make it really, useful, it's a ton of work, as in like
decades of work.
Some early on, once it was useful and people were actually using it to do things, then I was like, okay, it seems like something worth trying to run as a business.
Did you ever consider not doing that? I mean, my understanding is that you were in a position where and again, I may not be understanding this correctly, but my impression was from a financial perspective, you probably didn't need to do that.
Yeah, no, but it is a nice thing. Businesses don't have to be like things that grow and, become these big monsters and have vision and all of these things. Like, yeah, there's a coffee shop down the street from me, and the people who own it like work at the counter every day because they really like making coffee, and they make the best coffee. And so I go in there and I give them money, and they give me really good coffee and like baked goods that they make, and it's awesome for everybody. So yeah, that's kind of the nice thing about it is like, even if you don't have to do that, you have that relationship with people. And the whole free software, I'm all in favor of, and I like using and stuff. But also, it's just a different sort of paradigm, and it doesn't necessarily really mirror other things that we have in society today.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Ardour sits at a weird conjunction of those two things, right? Because we're technically open source, but at some point, like in around 2009, I got to a place where it seemed that the writing was on the wall, and I needed to figure out some way of actually of making a living from it, or stop doing it. And so, it's evolved at this slightly strange conjunction where the whole thing is open source, but there's a goal there to actually treat it as if it was a business, and it generates not exactly vast amounts of cash, but certainly a comfortable living.
Has that been an awkward?
I would have said in general, it's not tremendously awkward. I mean, it gets a little tiring. Actually, it's interesting to me how the frequency of people saying, I thought it was free, and having to explain this age-old, free as in beer, free as in speech distinction. Like the frequency of that has really been going down over the last few years. That used to be very irritating and tiresome, and would lead me to always wonder, is this the right combination of things? Maybe it shouldn't be one, or perhaps I shouldn't be actually trying to combine both of these things. But the last few years, the frequency of that kind of thing has gone down a lot. And now the open source part of it, I wouldn't say that I think of it as an irrelevance. But it just doesn't seem as though it conflicts very much with the fact it's also supposed to be something that makes a living for me and perhaps some other people as well.
How does it work? How many people are like regular contributors? What percentage of your time do you spend, merging patches and things like that?
So I think for quite a number of years now, we've been at a point where there are effectively 2 full-time developers that work on the program, which is myself and Robin Garius. And that, Robin was already quite involved with the project, but he got hired by Harrison Consoles that we collaborate with to produce Mixbus. And at that point, he became really a full-time person. So there's the 2 of us who work on it as a full-time job. I mean, from my perspective, I wake up in the morning and I go to work on Ardour. The patches and, the third-party stuff it comes in, it's not even really waves. I don't know, what would you call it? It comes in rain showers or something. I don't know. There'll be periods where there'll suddenly be a brief flurry of activity, either from people previously involved in the project or from people that we've never heard from previously. These days, I would say most of those don't tend to be very big chain sets. So, I remember that one of the first people to contribute to the program, just showed up one day and had a completely new mode or new way of using the mouse. I can't remember exactly what the mode was, but perhaps we didn't have a range select at that point. And he just showed up with this huge patch that just added range mode to everything. That sort of thing, that doesn't tend to happen much anymore. There's a couple of exceptions. There's a guy out there right now who's still working on fixing up a patch that is going to add a complete tracker interface to Ardour, for example.
Nice.
And it's gigantic and it's huge, and luckily it's mostly disconnected from the rest of the code base. So, I mean, I would say it's really not much of a diversion to be dealing with the fact that other people could be contributing stuff, that there just aren't that many people contributing, substantial things.
Are there patches that come in where you're like, yeah, I'm just not touching that? Or do you end up pretty much...
There's some, actually. I mean, the most recent one was completely well intended, but I guess there's some utility you can get, I think, that finds spelling errors in comments in code. And somebody had used it on the code base, and it's great. I mean, they're all actual spelling mistakes, right? And there's nothing wrong with fixing them up. but it's an enormous patch. And I have no real objection to applying it in principle, but to make sure that everything's okay, I have to read the whole thing. I don't want to review it. So, occasionally things like that will come in. There'll be occasional ones from people who have either completely or slightly misunderstood how things work. And there'll also be patches occasionally from people where we don't want to apply it, not because there's anything wrong with the patch, but it just feels like it's continuing on something that we don't want to perpetuate anymore. There's stuff with control surfaces, for example, that we would love to completely re-engineer. And if somebody comes up with a patch that feels like it's really locking that code in even more, and one of my first inclinations is to sort of say, it's great work, and we'd like the functionality, but we just don't really want to go down in that direction anymore. So I would say that, the open source aspect of it really doesn't create very much more work. Most of what happens with the program happens with the people who are working it full time. And I've been really struck by the way in which, from what I can read, that in a way your, what can we call it? I don't know, staffing levels, available person hours or something, kind of has matched ours. You've had about 2 people for the most part, right?
Yeah, we've fluctuated between 2 and 3, but for the last number of years, it's been 2, and we pretty much are similar, working full time, wake up in the morning, program, test, occasionally deal with other things as they come up, but that's.
There was a period when I think you had a slightly larger number of people floating around. Is that true?
We early on, Christoph, someone who I worked with for years before that, did a bunch of work on Reaper, Christoph Thibault, and then he left to go work in like gaming and stuff. I think he worked for Blizzard for a while, and then someone who developed extensions, Jeffos, John Francois. He worked for us for a while, and then for I think maybe 2 or 3 years, and then it's just been myself and John Schwa for many years.
Just in terms of physical location, where are you guys based?
We're both in New York, but he's about 100 miles away from the city, and I'm in Brooklyn now.
Okay, so you don't interact physically too much. It's all remote.
We occasionally we go on hikes and things like that.
But the working side of it, you just do on machines at home, and
right, yeah. There's very little phone calls to it. It's pretty much everything we do is, at this point is Slack.
We haven't really had much of a need to use anything other than IRC, which is, again, just text-based stuff. And the collaboration with Harrison, we do have a weekly meeting there, which I participate in just really because it makes sense. Other than that there's kind of no non-text messaging thing that seems really that necessary. There have been times in the past where I think we've had more people engaged in contributions and fixes and things, and IRC has worked very well for that for us.
You and Robin are pretty geographically distributed, I guess.
Yeah, I mean he's
time zone.
He's in Berlin, but he really lives on West Coast time, which is a habit he picked up. He was in Berkeley for a while years and years ago, and I don't think it's true to say he never switched back. That's not really true, but for a variety of reasons. I mean, there have been a number of occasions where he goes to bed after I do, and he's technically 8 hours ahead of me. But that has worked quite well. There are times when I wish that we could actually meet in person more frequently. Not because I think it would actually, I don't feel as though it would ever contribute to a particular issue with development. But it would just be nice. I mean, as you were saying, going for a hike.
Yeah, no, it's good to maintain the sort of those relationships, and it's hard text-based to know how someone feels about something, or just how they feel in general. Whereas in person, it's a lot easier.
So, I mean, continuing on a little bit in this direction, I mean, there are significant chunks of Reaper's code base that actually are open source, although the program itself is not. Have you ever given any thought, or do you have any reflections on what the history of Reaper might have been if you'd have just decided to do the whole thing as open source, but perhaps still had it, as a commercial product?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it is hard to speculate. I mean, because I wouldn't want to sign up for the amount. I mean, I know you don't get that many patches, but in my mind, I would get so many patches and I would have to deal with all these people. And so, but I don't know. It's hard to say. If you look at the quantity of like some of the extension plugins of things that people want to do, it's easy to see how that could end up being a lot. But maybe, had it been open source, maybe the barrier of entry is higher. I don't know. But like if you look at the SWS extensions, for example, there's just like a ton of stuff in there. And a lot of it's really useful, but it's like, a ton of stuff written by 10 different people, each with its own different style. So when you go to try to debug it, it can be challenging. You just bounce around looking at different things, figuring out, what's connected to what.
I don't know why we've been so successful at avoiding that particular problem. I mean, the whole stylistic thing, like I tried to never even make a big deal out of it. I mean, we do have a web page somewhere that lays out, coding style things, but rarely need to invoke it.
I think when you're completely open source, it's easier because like I've gone and contributed to other projects, and it's like you definitely like, you go make a patch for Git or something, and it's like, oh, it's very obvious what the rules are here, the formatting, the way variables are named, all that. It's very clearly laid out. There is a guide, but you don't really need to look at it. Like if you read the code enough to actually make a patch for it, it'll be obvious what's necessary.
My main feeling with whether you would get loads of contributions. I mean, I don't know whether or not there's something specific to Ardour itself, or maybe to my personality, or at least my online personality. I don't know, but I just don't think there's that many people out there who can actually contribute to projects at this scale. It just requires too many skills that, even if you were trying to hire somebody and pay them a lot of money, you wouldn't have a very easy time finding them.
That I agree with, though. Yeah. And also just setting up to compile a DAW, that's probably a lot of a big barrier of entry just to get that built. Yeah,
certainly on Windows and Mac OS, that's for sure. It's a huge barrier.
And that's the vast majority of our users.
Yeah, right. I mean, we still don't have a convenient way for, say, somebody who wanted to work on Ardour on Windows to actually get things set up. I mean, periodically somebody shows up and says, I'm going to build a Docker image or something. And we always say, oh, that's great. Get back to us when it's done and we'll put it up. And we never hear anything from anybody again. We don't even build, our Windows builds don't even happen on Windows. We just cross-compile them on Linux. So we don't actually use Windows for anything at all. And so that problem of setting up the environment is a thing that possibly, unfortunately, we just don't really pay much attention to. And possibly that just excludes a lot of people who could maybe be involved. I'm not sure, but my gut feeling is, C++, real-time, multi-threaded, memory allocation aware, complicated GUI. It's a set of skills that is just really hard to find, no matter what the incentives are.
That's true. I agree. How there is the whole Dunning-Kruger effect. So you never know. But yeah. So going back to the original question, though, what would Reaper look like? I don't know. I mean, early on there were things like, to license Rewire, which was the propeller head technology. Like they wouldn't even license it to anyone open source or anyone free. Even I think it was like you had to be like they wanted people to be very businessy. I guess to compile with VST too, you have to. That's an awkward place to be for open source. You can't distribute the VST2 headers and things like that. So yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. It's somewhat unanswerable, I suppose. I guess it would have depended on how it went. But I do think there's something to be said about having a light business relationship with users and the sort of that transactional system is something that people are very used to because that's the way the rest of society works. But if you had done that along with open source, that would have, that could have been interesting, I suppose. But it's also confusing to people that something is free and not free.
So how does that work in terms of support, though? Because I would say that, you were asking about what's the load like of having, third-party pull requests and so on. I would say that's tiny compared to customer support. And, you're in an extremely similar position. You've got a fairly explicit business transactional relationship with many of your users. How does that impact, or what kind of support load does that create for you, and how do you deal with that?
Having a free trial that is fully functional is a good first step because, before people purchase it, they use it, they make sure it works, make sure that it's compatible with their things. You can that filters out a lot of issues, I would imagine. And then we also we have a pretty much a policy of we don't give support. And we're clear about that. So, make sure it works before you buy it. And, and then we have a user forum, which is very helpful. And we do end up supporting, but we don't guarantee support. And then, we also have a support email that people email, and we try to deal with them as much as possible. But the main thing is how can we optimize the relationship with users so that we don't have to deal with them? And we do that. We try to do that. And then at the end of the day, the person who ends up dealing most with people who email and whatnot is Ollie, who's been he's been working remotely from Germany for the last 10 plus years, and he does a really good job. And honestly, if he ever leaves, I'll probably open source Reaper and call it a day. Because I don't want to have to deal with that. So, I mean,
I was worried for a moment that you would say that the way to deal with all of that stuff is that you just write perfect software that has no bugs or design flaws. But
well, that's too obvious. I mean, don't we all, right? Yeah.
Well, Ardour's evolved in I think a somewhat similar way. Although I think I maybe feel slightly less comfortable with shrugging off, well, maybe not shrugging off, but sort of saying that we don't really do support. But it is true that the user community in the end has evolved to become one of the best support mechanisms out there. It somehow seems less active than the one that surrounds Reaper. It seems like you've been remarkably successful at creating a user community that is not only fairly large, but also quite active and connected and doing all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, we've been really, really fortunate. And I mean, there's a lot of really, really good, helpful users. And in general, aside from occasional incidents, everybody is really very everybody gets along for the most part, which is a difficult thing on the internet.
Yeah, I mean, we've been somewhat successful at that, but I think not quite as successful as in the Reaper world. We have people who are around who are very knowledgeable about the program and are very helpful to people, but it doesn't cover as many of the bases. And the other thing that for us tends to be an issue is that the Windows community, even though it's just as big as the Linux community on Ardour, it's a totally different category of user. Most of the Linux users tend to be at least a little bit technical in some way, and they tend to be able to provide help to each other a lot more. Whereas the Windows community is pretty silent until somebody steps up and says, "Hey, I'm on Windows and I'm having a problem." And if it's a Windows specific problem, we cross our fingers and say, well, we hope somebody from the Windows community will sort of step up, but it doesn't very often happen. And we certainly don't have the resources to track down system specific problems. I mean, if there's a general problem on Windows that is happening to everybody on Windows, then we would look into that. But, if it's on this machine, every time I start up and I hit the record button, it goes blue or something. It's just like, I'm sorry. That's what it does on your machine and on nobody else's.
We had one that an issue come up recently, which was only affected pre-SSE. It was only AMD processors on Windows, earlier AMD processors that had some issue with the JSONic scripts that it's ICC's fault because we use an old version of ICC, the Intel C compiler, that produces different code for generic versus Intel, legitimate Intel or genuine Intel CPUs. Even if the AMD processors support all the same extensions and whatever, it runs the slow code on them.
So, as an aside, there, do you actually write any? Do you handwrite any assembly for Reaper or not?
Very, very little. There's some SSE intrinsics for some sample rate conversion that gets used. There's a bunch of assembly that gets used for the JSFX JSONic scripts because they get compiled to assembly. So there's some stubs for that and like some C code that generates assembly for each of the architectures that we run on. But almost everything is C++. Yeah.
Yeah, we use it only for metering. That's the only place that we sort of handcraft stuff at that level.
Getting the maximum value of samples, or
I mean, it's the only real DSP that even happens in Ardour. I mean, I suppose you could include faders, but I mean, we don't have any. There's no DSP built into the program at all, and so the only thing that really sits there and chomps on samples is the metering. And we found when we first did that, this is probably back in, maybe the 2008 timeframe or so, that especially with larger buffer sizes, it made just an enormous difference, like a 30% drop in CPU load. With smaller buffer sizes, it's not anywhere near as dramatic as that. But interestingly, we've been revisiting that in the recent past, and compilers have caught up, or compilers plus intrinsics and what have you have caught up. And now we just landed a pull request today from the guy who's been working on this, and most of the code that's in there now is actually compiler generated. He's hand tweaked some of the arrangement of it, but we can't do better than the compilers. Whereas in 2008 we could beat them by a significant margin.
That similar sort of thing of getting the maximum absolute value. We actually do just treating the doubles as 64-bit integers and then, twiddle some bits and go that route, which last I checked was the fastest. Even on 32-bit CPUs, the compiler would do a really good job of that. Not that, we really worry about 32-bit anymore.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've now got code for all of the various SIMD instruction sets that tries to leverage that, and it's a significant, again, on larger buffer sizes it's a huge win, but there's nothing else where we would do that. So all right, I want to move on to another big question that's been on my mind, and I'm very interested in your thoughts about this. So I wrote a long post on the Ardour forums, I don't know, a year and a half ago or something now, 2 years ago. We had a guy who came over from Reaper and was trying Ardour out and wanted to do various scripting things. And, we have a scripting language. We use Lua, and you can do all kinds of things with it. But he wanted to do some things that you couldn't do. I think specifically he wanted to create GUI dialogues and populate them with user interface stuff. And our scripting capabilities don't let you do that. And sort of got into a back and forth with this user about whether it should and whether it shouldn't. And I wouldn't say it was an argument. There was a healthy debate about we're open source, right? You don't need to use scripting to do all this stuff. You could just write it yourself. You can access any part of the program. And along the way, it made me start to reflect a lot on the difference between what you've done in Reaper with scripting and Ardour being open source plus scripting as well. And it seems to me, the title of that post was, I think it was, is open source a diversion from what users really want? And I think I came down leaning firmly in the direction of saying that, as much as I hate to admit it, I think it really is.
Well, it sounds like you're using it as an excuse not to add functionality, because you're like, well, why should we add that if you can just go edit the source, even though that's really difficult and no one really wants to do that?
Yeah, I think the last part of what you just said there is maybe the key element.
Which was the point you made earlier. So
I think when I started writing Ardour, the idea that other people would contribute to a project written in C++ by building it and compiling it and modifying the code seemed kind of like a no-brainer. I mean, there were all kinds of projects all over the place, right? That they worked that way. That's how you modified them. That's how you extended them. Now, you've done something in Reaper, though, where I may be giving you too much credit here, but I sometimes get the feeling that you force yourselves to actually eat your own dog food. That you've actually you've made sure that the scripting was there for you to do things you wanted to do with Reaper, not just as a layer for users. I think if you're looking at it as eating your own dog food, then you're totally doing it wrong, because the capabilities that you want to have and that you have. I mean, Reaper, before I made Reaper, I made the programmable effects JesusSonic thing, which had no commercial potential at all, but integrated into Reaper, it's the best environment for prototyping any DSP or audio processors or MIDI processors, or it's like not having to compile and go through that cycle of compile, run, potentially crash, and just being able to just write things and test them out is like the best thing that you can have. And so rather than, if we're going to add something, rather than going and just adding it, if it's possible to do it as a script in a JesusSonic script, or a script as a rescript to try something out, it's so much faster and easier, and it's not difficult. It makes life more enjoyable and is a productivity boost ultimately, and morale boost. How have you managed the fact? I mean, one of the issues we have in Ardour, one of the reasons why we don't export 100% of everything to our Lua API, is that we want their internal APIs to be subject to change on demand. I mean, if we suddenly realize that we didn't do this properly,
right.
How have you managed that issue with your scripting support?
Well, we don't expose everything, and we don't expose it. Ideally, we try to avoid exposing the implementation details of it, and instead just provide some sort of abstracted interface that that you end up with a wrapper that especially if you change the design of something eventually, that has to be maintained and improved and gets more complex. But So, you think twice about exposing something to the API unless you're like really sure that you want it to have to support it forever. But ultimately, if the functionality is going to be there, then you're going to have to expose it in some way. And then you end up with like, this, the extended version of that API and then the second extended version of that API or whatever. But it's the price you pay, and it's not really that big of a price. It's just a bunch of stubs that call, wrappers that call the old version of the function or the new version of the function with defaults and things like that. We have a UI, a very simple graphic output UI thing that we originally made for JSON, and then we use it for Rescript so people can build UIs in Rescript. And we also have bindings for it for Lua. And I could probably, most of that's open source, but there's probably some of the Lua glue that I could send your way or open source if you guys want to use that for building UIs, because it's pretty handy and fun. Or you could just use something like IMG UI, whatever that, those immediate mode things are. And that might be worth doing too.
Yeah, I feel like we're still evaluating a little bit what our long-term, approach to this has been. I mean, we do expose an awful lot of the internals, and we're generally fairly happy to add stuff. If somebody the other day wanted to be able to, our MIDI tracks have a controller over whether they actually receive MIDI input, even if they're connected. And there was no way to turn it on and off from Lua. And it was just a case of adding two tiny, it's not even a stub, it's just a binding of the Lua, function name to the C++ one. And I'm quite happy to add that when requests come up. On the other hand, the bigger picture of like, well, can you create a whole dialogue and can you do this and do that in it? Feels like a much bigger kind of a transformation.
I think doing something that's halfway to that, where you just give people the basic ability to say, draw a bitmap, or, draw basic primitives into create a window and draw primitives and get mouse events. And then people can build on top of that in Lua and build very complex UIs however they want. But giving those basic primitives in the sort of most minimal way possible will let people go and do really cool things. And then you're not locked into supporting a bunch of controls and dialogues and, different kinds of controls and all these things.
It's sort of the evolution of the same crowd that used to skin Winamp, right? And now they can do this stuff.
Yeah, or think of it more like, your Atari booting into BASIC. You got to have these basic capabilities, and then you can do anything you want.
Yeah. It's been a very interesting dynamic, it's that question that blog post put up. I mean, there were lots of responses to it, and it's a question that sort of keeps coming up in various forms, over time. And it's a little, I don't know if I would, I suppose I would go so far as it's a little frustrating to reflect upon and thinking, well, I created this tool in which everybody has access to everything. Like, you can go ahead and look at all the code and modify any of the code to do anything you want. Oh, that's not what you wanted? You didn't want to have a compiler? Wait, you're afraid of C++? Oh, you don't like build systems? What the hell is wrong with you people? And, there's the answer on your side of things in Reaper, which is saying, yeah, you don't have to worry about all of that stuff, but you can script pretty much anything you want. And it's a salutary reminder, I think, to the open source world that although open source does have a set of benefits that I think actually go beyond these sorts of questions, it's not necessarily the answer. In fact, almost never is the answer to, hey, I need to slightly adjust the behavior of this program. How do I do that?
Yeah, unless it's, fixing something that you can submit a patch for, I suppose. But even then, yeah, that's difficult. I did hear something good, which was, the whole free as in beer, free as in speech. The reality ends up being free as in puppy. It's like, yeah, okay. Which I love dogs, so yeah, it's a positive thing, but it's not without its consequences, I guess.
let's jump on to anticipatory processing. So I'm intrigued by this because I would say about 6 months ago, I was thinking very hard about something that feels like it's related very much to why you might have done this. And I had this sudden insight and thought, I finally understand why Justin did this, or why he might have done this in the first place. Because I don't know why you did this. So I'm intrigued by what your original motivations were for this design, and as a corollary to that, how does that look today? Since I know you've changed things around quite a bit, or you've made it possible for the user to do things in very different ways. So perhaps you could talk about that for a bit.
Yeah. So back when multiprocessing was new, anticipatory FX means that on the tracks that are not record armed or not downstream from tracks that are record armed, Reaper will go and render later blocks for those tracks, so that when the audio thread comes along and needs to render the tracks, it doesn't have to render all of them. The ones that are pre-rendered for the next couple hundred milliseconds, it can it can just pull the buffers and call it a day. And that was done before the sort of traditional multiprocessing mode of where you have 2 or 4 different threads total that go and process each track and then sum all the results. And the original goal was just to do that so that you didn't have to synchronize all the threads and be really fast about that. And then also the other benefit is if you have effects that do FFTs and things like that, you don't have to worry about them smoothing out their workload over time. So the initial version of some of the effects that we made, like the Reaper FFT processor, which you could run at 4K or 16K FFT size, which is not great for low latency processing, because you'll process 30 blocks in a row and then suddenly you're like, oh shit, I got a ton of work to do. And so if you're not record monitoring on the track, then it doesn't really matter if it runs a couple hundred milliseconds ahead and deals with all of that. And then so it solved a number of different problems while putting off having to do the difficult work of low latency multiprocessing and stuff, which eventually did get done.
Do you feel it still has an important and useful role today?
Oh, I think it totally helps in a lot of instances, and the downside's pretty minimal. I think it's a really useful thing. And I think, like maybe a couple years after we did that, Logic added a hybrid mode where it runs, like, instead of doing blocks ahead, it would just generate a 1,024 sample block for tracks that aren't monitoring, and then it would just piecemeal that out to save CPU or save real-time CPU. Which, that also has some benefits, has some drawbacks, that you lose some of the automation accuracy and things like that. I think it's really useful, and the downside of having it's pretty low. The only things that come up are when people are like, why are my plugins running at different times and stuff? And it's like, well, who says all the plugins have to run at the same time? I don't know. And then also, like, for things like UAD, I guess that was also an issue. And if you're running over network stuff, there's all sorts of corner cases. But in general, I think it's definitely helpful and gives you a lot more sort of headroom on the real-time side of things.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that Reaper has I think a well-deserved reputation for being able to handle a given, I don't know what to call it, session project configuration load with lower CPU load than most other DAWs. And I think, when I was thinking about this particular issue a few months ago, the way I kind of formulated it in my head is that if you look at Ardour, where we have always done everything in the real time context. The interrupt it's not even an interrupt from the audio interface, but anyway, some interrupt comes in that says, hey, there's work to do, and so we do the work, and then we hand the results back to the audio interface, and we carry on. If let's say you've got 5 milliseconds to do the work, but you're only using 1 millisecond of it, because actually your load isn't that high. I don't know if I call it a problem, but it's definitely a noticeable thing that there's 4 milliseconds of time there where the threads that do processing don't do anything. They're just asleep. And you've just basically thrown that away and said, well, I know you guys could be awake right now. I mean, there's nothing else happening on the CPU, but we don't do things that way. Like, you're not going to wake up and do work until we tell you to.
It doesn't have to be the same thread. I mean, you could have other threads and let the OS do that, and
Sure. Well, I didn't mean necessarily the exact same threads, but essentially you've got 4 milliseconds of time there in which you're not actually doing any processing at all. And, as long as the loads stay nice and low, it's not really that big of a deal. Nobody really sees the difference much at all unless they pay close attention to some metering system that the DAW has in it. But there is some sense, or at least the particular issue when I was thinking about this was one in which, it's a little silly that we throw away all that time and don't do anything with it. I mean, yeah, it's nice that the GUI is staying nice and responsive and what have you, but Reaper does that too anyway. Well,
I mean, it's the same amount of work needs to be done regardless. So if there's not that much work to do, then not doing work, it makes the most sense. And the CPU can save some power probably, and
well, but the fact that you can use larger block sizes, and so you can amortize the whole process call overhead.
We don't actually use larger block sizes, but yeah, you could. Yeah, Logic does. We just render.
Yeah, the hybrid model does.
Render the blocks ahead of time so that they're available. It's just it's essentially just a very, very short-lived cache, yeah.
Do you think if you were starting to do a DAW today with the typical core counts that are floating around, and already understanding whatever problems and solutions that you face for multiprocessing thing, do you think you would still do that?
I think the capabilities would be worth doing. I'd probably design it a little differently and make the block size more dynamic, so that you could, as you say, amortize the per block stuff. But for the most part, no. I think it's good, especially for plugins that are poorly behaved, like the ones we write. I mean, since then, like our convolution reverb, we added a mode where it goes and sends some work to a background thread and stuff like that, which is good for if you want to actually monitor your convolution reverb and things like that. But not having to do that for every plugin is kind of nice.
The most extreme example of this that I've noticed recently, I've stopped focusing on it now because I found my solution, but it was just kind of remarkable, the difference in behavior was using VCV Rack. I don't know whether you've used VCV Rack at all, but it does everything with single sample processing, and it needs to do that just because of you need that in a modular engine. But you can also set the thread count to be as high as the number of cores that you have. And I was having these patches that I was running with, at a naive level, it's like I've got 16 cores. Why don't I use 16 threads? I've got this huge modular patch. I should just let it run. And it couldn't play the patches. And I tried reducing things down to 8 threads and then 4 and back up to 12 and could never really find an obvious pattern. Sometimes it would be a little better, sometimes it would be a little bit worse, but the sound would break up, it would click and pop and do all the things that we know and love.
Wait, how do you paralyze that?
And then
parallelize that? I don't understand.
You basically have to put the modules, as I understand it, what Andrew's doing there, and I hope to have a chat with him about all this stuff, but he's running the modules in different threads, which is possibly a little naive, but is also an obvious way to do it.
But how do you synchronize?
But the result is
the real question.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm going to get to. So I took this great big modular patch and I just said, get rid of all the threading, run the thing in one thread. And all the clicks and pops went away, and my CPU load was absolutely minuscule. And then the moment I began to add, more threads back in, CPU load goes through the roof, and the clicks and pops go, and it's all the synchronization costs. Right? I mean, the actual threads are doing almost nothing. They're processing one sample, right, and then they go back to sleep again. It's a very interesting problem to actually think about how you could parallelize, a single sample processing architecture like that.
I don't think you can, though, is the thing.
Yeah, I suspect that's the right answer. It's still interesting to think about.
I mean, you can on a hardware level, but anytime you have an OS and CPU cores with caches and that need to maintain coherence, then you're just basically making a ton more work for yourself and for the hardware. Well,
but the way in which you would start doing it, I think, wouldn't really be at that level. It would be identifying subgraphs, right, that you could pull out. In fact, what you really want is subgraphs that don't even need single sample processing because they have no feedback in them. And if you can pull those out of your overall data graph, then you can start to parallelize big chunks of it and use non-single sample processing. But anyway, I'm not writing a modular synth anytime soon, because we have racks. So, but it was really quite remarkable to see the total change in behavior. What felt like a complete machine overload. Oh, I'm just running too many, oscillators or something. Turns out to be just thread synchronization. Even for me, that seemed like quite a remarkable thing to bump into.
I don't know if you use Macs, but there's now new, the new M1 CPUs that have asymmetric cores, and so you get all sorts of weird things relating to that, where depending on which core you're using, the CPU use of something will vary. And so you can actually be in a mode where you're using less CPU and it's mostly idle, but then the CPU meter is higher. And so people are like, why is this using so much CPU? But it's just because it's not using as much power. And anyway, which
I saw the post that you did on managing the asymmetric CPUs. We haven't run into that yet. I think mostly on the Mac, mostly because we do the step that you had at the end already, which keeps all of our threads on the performance cores
joining
instead.
The work group of
joining the work group.
Yeah. When you synchronize threads, do you use just events and wait for single object or whatnot, or
We try to avoid any of that. We just operate with the pthreads library for Windows.
But what does it use internally, though?
And I haven't actually dived in and had a look. I looked at what it was doing for scheduling, and it doesn't do the right thing for scheduling.
Because a lot of what we do is end up pulling and sleeping but one thing I noticed was that wait for single object, which is the sort of standard way of synchronizing and waiting for a signal from another thread, was not as good at performance. And so then I then put me in touch with someone at Microsoft, and I replied asking, hey, is there a better way? And he was like, let me get back to you. And then it's been like a month. But so I'm always curious if anyone knows anything.
Yeah, I've the pthreads library that we use is open source, and I could just go in and actually check what con wait or whatever else we're doing uses. But I'm actually not even sure. I'm not actually completely convinced that we even use the pthreads primitives actually for that kind of stuff. It's possible that we rolled our own, because we have a lot of. One of the things that we do, it's not so much the real time critical thing. But we have a sort of a general primitive in Ardour for doing cross-thread signaling, where, something has happened in the, I don't know what you would call it, the back end, in the library, in the model or something. We need to tell the GUI about it. And we have sort of a general mechanism for doing that. And I know that the mechanism we use on Windows for that is not wait for single object, but is also not what we use on Unix-like systems either.
For very low latency notifications, or...
Well, that's the thing, though. I think the reason why that's probably different is that, no, that's not low latency. That's not low latency.
Yeah, no, I meant for having the multiprocessing thread being signaled by the audio thread to wake up, that sort of thing.
We very rarely drop down to platform primitives, except where we're really forced to. And whatever we're using for that, it didn't force us to drop down to the Windows stuff. Whereas, as I said, for this thread scheduling thing, the pthreads code just isn't doing it right. Or isn't, I shouldn't say it's not doing it right. It's doing it right, except it doesn't know about the MMCSS stuff. And so that ought to be added. All DAWs, there's lots of good stuff written about how it's, real-time code and you've got to do things differently and make sure it is real-time safe and you don't do any of the bad stuff.
We do all the bad stuff. Lots of locks, lots of, memory allocations where they shouldn't be. But we do them, I guess what it is that, you don't do them often. And, it's okay to have locks. You just have to make sure that they're not contentious. But there's only so much you can you can't avoid it all. And so, you have to find the right balance between, we're all human. And to err is human. So,
I must admit that I get headaches sometimes when I think about this stuff. In the sense that, so for example, I don't know how many years ago, maybe a decade ago, perhaps, we started using read, copy, update models for a lot of things. And it's really great on some level in the code because it frees you from having to think about all this stuff, right? You need to modify this real-time sensitive object. You just do RCU on it and you never have to really think about any of this stuff again. Everything just works and it's fine. But then something happens that forces you to go and dig back down into the guts of what you were doing again. And you start looking at how it works under the hood, even though you wrote what was under the hood. And it's just like, oh my God, how does this even work? And how is this safe? And, how is this even okay? And I had an interesting experience actually recently with RCU. I think that's probably why I'm remembering it. But I was very glad to have input from, there's a developer who goes by the handle of Markan. He's quite well known for doing a number of incredibly hairy things. At the moment, he's porting Linux to the M1 or the M1 Max, which, as you can imagine, involves an insane level of deep dives into, an insane amount of low-level stuff. But there was some incredibly weird bug that would show up in the RCU code, and it almost never shows up, but then when it does, it shows up really badly. And he went through it all and proposed fixes for how it was going to work. And they were not substantial. It wasn't like it was completely brain dead. It was just, a little bit wrong. Sort of like being a little bit dead or a little bit pregnant, And I looked at what he had done and I put it in place. And then I was reading it again. I'm like, there's no way this can work correctly. And I found race conditions and everything else. So I went back to him again. I said, look, I think this is still not right. There's a race condition here. And he very patiently walked me through how it's not a race condition because, yada, yada, yada. And it's interesting. It's been interesting to me how, I guess, first of all, how difficult all of that programming is. I mean, I see lots of people talking about how difficult it is, and then I sort of look at what I've done and what I know you've done and think, well, it's not that difficult. But then it turns out that actually there's a lot of subtleties buried away. And sometimes you deal with them not really by writing particularly clever code, but coming up with understandings. I mean, you were mentioning earlier, have locks that are not under much contention, right? That they're still locks, but you address the problem not with clever arcane programming, but by designing things so that your locks just don't suffer from contention.
The sophisticated fix of threat of lock-free programming versus the sort of avoiding the need for the lock in the first place is ultimately an interesting. I mean, it's a two different ways of going about life, I guess, in programming.
It's also intriguing to me how many of the things in this area seem to get constantly rediscovered and are not being known. I mean, I just watched a talk last week from CPPCon, that happened a couple of weeks ago, and somebody was talking about they have a new multi-producer, multi-consumer, lock-free ring buffer, and thought this was it's quite interesting. There was a guy from Google talking about it very much as though it was sort of a new invention, I guess you could say. And I was talking to Robin about this and said, oh, well, we have one of those in our code already that I got from somewhere else. And I went and looked at it, and it's very old. And, it's odd to me how a lot of these techniques and programming things, they're public, people talk about them, but none of them ever really seem to be written up or documented or available enough for it to be well known. Like, oh, this is how you do that.
Yeah, maybe it's not necessary. It's known, but not necessarily. Everyone hasn't agreed that that's the way to do it.
Yeah, but I think also the part of the reason there's no agreement is because nobody's actually talking. I mean, I think there's all kinds of elements of software where people have. I mean, if you look at stuff like all of the cryptographic stuff. I mean, people in that field talk to each other a lot about, good things and bad things and what you should and what you shouldn't do. And I just feel that in this, particularly with the area of things like lock-free data structures and to some extent even real-time as a whole, that those kinds of conversations are not really happening to the point where there can be a senior developer at Google who does a talk about a data structure as if it's new that is actually years old. It's just a strange thing.
I think part of it's also that, I don't know, like there's always unintended consequences with things too. Like you might switch to some different structure and, but then find that it interacts more poorly with some other element of your system. These are all such complex things like a DAW that, you might switch to something that's technically better, but then it causes contention elsewhere, that sort of thing. And
it's certainly true that once you get, I mean, I was just reading a mildly interesting article through Hacker News the other day that it was in a fairly high level language. And, it turned out that the shared pointer implementation in this language causes this particular piece of code that they've written to be slower on a 24-core machine than a single-core laptop. And it was all because the reference counters for the shared pointers were all shared among the cores. And whenever you updated them, it would invalidate caches across all the cores. And, this is a level of detail that, there's an awful lot of programmers out there. I don't know I would go so far as to say the overwhelming majority of people would never have to face issues like this, right? I'm not necessarily saying that we trip over it every day, but I feel like it's always lurking around the corner.
It is amazing, though. I mean, going back to just having worked on these products for so long, I don't know about on your side, but we, every so often you find a bug from 15 years ago that you're like, how is this even working? It's amazing how much incorrect code can work for, so long without being noticed. Or, maybe it did get noticed by someone somewhere, but it didn't get reported. And that, it's bizarre when you see things like that.
Another variation on that I came across a couple of weeks ago is not so much incorrect code, but code that behaves completely differently than my mental model of it, and that we use throughout Ardour. And you sort of discover this and think, how is it even possible that this has worked? And you go and check on it, and it turns out that, I don't know if I want to call it luck, like somehow, even though the mental model was wrong, the way we've used it has, until something was done last week, the mismatch wasn't obvious. It never had any side effects.
At some point, your understanding changed, but it didn't affect the code.
But yeah, I think this is actually. It wasn't even an understanding. I think we were just doing something slightly new as a slightly different design. I mean, we've been adding clip launching a la Ableton Live to Ardour, and it reuses a lot of code patterns and a lot of objects and stuff that we already have. But there's been some new properties. There's new aspects to how this works. Has caused us to go for some slightly tweaked, code models. And one of them was just enough of a tweak to suddenly expose the fact that, wait, that function we've been using for 20 years doesn't do what I thought it did. It does what I thought it did, but there was a side effect that I assumed it had, and it doesn't do it the way I thought it did. No. Yeah, and you're right. It's quite alarming that those things can happen after such a long period of time and with such a relatively large code base built around them. Speaking of code bases, GUI toolkits. Now, you with Reaper essentially wrote, as far as I understand, you wrote this entirely from scratch.
Yeah. So what happened was I wrote the first version of Reaper just as a Windows application using Windows controls and Windows for everything. And then it turns out that, Windows, the hwind primitive of a window on Windows is a pretty resource intensive object. And, there's a finite number of windows that a system can have created at any given point. And if one application creates too many of them, it's sort of bad. So when you have a DAW with 100 tracks, and each track has a window it's like panel and then like 10 different windows for buttons and things like that, then suddenly you've just made 1,000 of these things. And so that was the first step, is being like, oh, well, we need to make these little virtual windows so that we don't have to create a window for every button that we use. And so it's been this sort of gradual step of replacing a lot of the individual controls that were OS hwinds with, little themable, things that get drawn to a bitmap. So anyway, we did that, and then so gradually Windows things sort of got replaced with little C++ wrapper, very lightweight objects that draw to bitmaps, that sort of thing. And then eventually it was like, we should make a Mac port, especially once the Intel Macs came out. And then at that point I started writing a wrapper library that would called Swell, which would wrap sort of the hwind primitive and map it to NS views and NS windows and things like that. And so that library, we still write, Reaper's all written as Win32 code, but then targets a subset of Win32, which then gets mapped pretty much without any cost to Coco on Mac. And then for Linux, eventually I wrote a version targeting GDK that just uses essentially Cairo to blit and GDK for mouse events and things like that. And so that emulates the whole hwind hierarchy, completely sort of its own implementation of it, which it's kind of funny because it's actually like the most efficient way to do things. Because preferences window where you have OS buttons and things like that, everything on Linux is actually the fastest and most efficient because it uses the least from the OS. So it's just as the simplest and most straightforward way to do it. Though it's still lacking in some respects, I guess from accessibility, it's not up to parity with macOS and Windows yet.
We had some questions on the Ardour forums last week about the accessibility thing, and people always compare it to Reaper on Windows, and I like to point out that Reaper on Linux can't do that at all. I think it sounds to me as though that pathway that you followed felt like a very natural one to you. You didn't stop somewhere along the way and say, like, what am I doing?
No, I mean, I think it started out as a wander, and but I think it puts us in a good place. And Swell being open source, I think, is also something that is potentially useful for other people. I don't know how much it gets used, but I've used it for a few other projects, and it's actually it's a pretty nice way to do it. If you like writing Win32 code, which I assume you probably don't.
I've never written a line of code for Windows in my life, so that's not 100% true. I shouldn't say it that pointedly yet, but more or less never done. I've never done that. But I mean, you didn't have the feeling along the way like, this is crazy. There ought to be a thing that already exists that I could use for this.
I mean, it would be nice if there was some universally great way to write multi-platform graphical applications, but I mean, I'm not trying to solve that problem.
But I mean, you didn't look at Qt, for example, and say, "Oh yeah, let's just use Qt. It's there and it works across platforms." You carried on forging ahead, even though something like that existed.
Well, I mean, at that point, to rewrite an already somewhat mature, or not, maybe forget mature, but at least a extensive application to switch from Win32 to some toolkit would be a huge project. So, why not instead just write a wrapper layer to have that existing thing target whatever it needs to? Which I actually am happy about now, because one of these days I'll probably just make a completely a version that will target. Well, actually, I was thinking the existing version targeting Wayland directly rather than going through GDK at some point soon. But also, you could just target like a generic frame buffer and get rid of the entire windowing system, and that might be fun too.
Yeah, I have a very hard time right now understanding what condition Wayland is in. I seem to keep reading very conflicting reports about, where it's gotten to. And, sometimes it seems like it's around the corner, and it'll be here, in a few months on every Linux distribution. And then I read stuff that basically just says it's broken beyond repair. So I've generally just put it out of my mind for the time being and assume that there'll be some layer that means I don't have to think about Wayland anyway. Even when it is actually, even when it shows up and is being widely used.
I've been using it on like my Ubuntu laptop, and it all works fine. I haven't really, there are a number of bugs in GNOME that happen on X11 that don't happen on the Wayland boot of it. So, but I haven't done any of the targeting it directly. It's just letting GDK do the wrapping, however it does. I think it probably just goes through X11 emulation or whatever.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I'm intrigued by the GUI choices is, I went down a different path from the beginning of deliberately choosing a toolkit that was at least nominally cross-platform, and letting them take care of the cross-platform elements, from the beginning.
Have you run into things that frustrate you about that?
We've had to do some work. I've done a lot of work on the Mac OS Quartz version of GDK and GTK. Because there are bits of it that were just completely wrong or could be dramatically improved. It's unfortunate now that, we're still stuck with a very old version of GTK, which is the toolkit that we're using. And So now whenever I do things to that level, it's kind of irrelevant. It's never going to show up in the mainstream because GTK3 and GTK4 use a completely different drawing model than GTK2. So there's nothing that I do to Ardour or for Ardour now that has any real relevance to the toolkit as a whole. There have been some frustrations, but I remember, for example, in the past when I've done some sort of collaborations with Waves, and those guys, they will use Qt, which, has a reputation for being much more truly cross-platform, and finding that, they ran into just as many low-level problems where there was a slight mismatch in the abstractions that one underlying windowing system was using versus another one. And the only difference being that in the case of GTK, I fixed them. And in the case of Waves, they didn't fix them. They just found workarounds or just lived with them. So I don't feel it was a bad choice. I think that over the years, we continue to keep talking about moving completely away from GTK and sitting everything on top of GDK or some similar abstraction. We have what we call the canvas in Ardour, which is sort of our own, it's our own drawing and event handling system that has Z-axis stacking as well as, XY stuff. So you can layer things. But it has the problem that, for us at least, we always remember there are these 4 things in GUIs that we just don't want to have to re-implement. One of them is text input. One of them are tree views. One of them is a file browser, and the other one is menus. And, you can have the best little drawing package in the world that lets you do all kinds of cool stuff and layer things and do alpha and compositing style blending and all that stuff, but it doesn't really address any of those 4 things. At some point, if we really want to move away from GTK, we have to bite the bullet and figure out what we would do about those 4.
They're not that bad to do if you just have to suck it up and do them,
Well, left to right.
Right to left.
Right to left text.
Yeah. No, yeah, it's as it was said earlier. They're not difficult. They're just a ton of work. But you can chip away at them. You don't have to solve all the problems at once. You just do a little at a time. And
things like file browsers are one of the most amusing to me because I think is one of the things where Linux really stands out in the sense that there is no system file browser on Linux, right? And so every program that wants to do its own toolkit thing has to figure out what they're going to do about the file browser, and it's interesting to look at all the different solutions that people come up with for that.
But what's great about writing your own is that you get to the things that annoy you about other ones, you get to improve upon.
That's true.
It's satisfying.
And it is also true that in some particular cases, like the work we're doing on clip launching right now, we need something that's a lot like a file browser, but sort of isn't, it's letting you look at your file system, but it doesn't necessarily portray it literally as a file system. And maybe it shows you metadata in preference to file names, for example, stuff like that. So yeah, there are benefits, to doing it oneself, but it is noticeable how I think, on Mac OS on Windows, if your application wants to use it to select a file, it's really obvious what you do. Right?
Yeah. But at the same time, Apple just constantly breaks their file browser and changes weird corner case behaviors. And, it's also just, not having to deal with that's pretty nice.
Yeah. And then you got things we just noticed that VCV, for example, then the latest version, Andrew's trying to solve this problem in VCV Rack and, running into issues with the plugin version because the solutions he's adopting use GTK3. And one of the problems, you can't use that in a host that uses it's problematic. I mean, Robin and I generally tend to say to people these days, if you think you're writing plugins, just don't even think about using any conventional toolkit at all. I mean, you can use Juice, but in terms of the ones that are very visible, Juice is probably the only thing that you should think about using. Just because they get it right, not because it's necessarily vastly superior to all the other things, but they just get the stuff right that needs to be done for plugins. I mean, I often felt like it would be awesome if there was. I mean, Juice almost is the toolkit for audio applications. It's just that those of us who started 16 or 20 years ago,
I don't know. I'm sure it does a lot of things right, but I find it to be just to make my head hurt if I try to figure out what anything does, just because there's so many layers of abstraction, and it's just impossible for me. I like things simple and if I have to look through more than a few files to find the thing I'm looking for, then you've lost.
To be fair, I'm speaking highly of it without really even having looked at more than a tiny part of the API. I haven't
looked at it in like 10 years, but when I last did, it was just, and I'm sure it's great, and it's just for smarter people than me is really what it is. It's like trying to look through Apple's documentation for, anything. You want to look for some method in NS string or something, and it's like you have to look in like 5 different places. You have to look at like the main thing, and then there's like the AppKit extensions to it, and then there's oh no, you're actually meant the mutable string, or like there's just not like one good place where you can go and say, what's the answer to this? It's like you just have to dig and dig and dig, and it's just a nightmare.
Or it turns out you're accidentally reading the Swift page, and it's got an API that they didn't include in the Objective-C version, or vice versa, right? Which has happened to me a few times.
I haven't run into that, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. At some point, my browser just got caught in those loops where I've been looking at this one part of apple.com, and it got flipped over to using the Swift development pages, and you're looking through stuff. And I don't remember the pages looking quite like this. Oh well, I'll just keep reading them, and you find what you want most of the time, and then every once in a while you don't find what you want, and then you suddenly look down at the bottom or the top of the page or something and realize, oh damn it, why am I reading the Swift documentation? It's quite irritating. How important in your code design, I mean, in Ardour, I would say we try to adhere fairly strongly to like the classical model view controller type of design. Is that a thing that you take into account in what you're doing, or is it kind of ad hoc?
What is that just meaning, like separating your UI from your actual main function of the program? Is that...
You didn't have to put it quite
exactly.
You didn't have to put it quite so simply.
I mean, I think we try to separate the UI from the UI is just a view into the structures that define the program. Yeah, I mean, let's put it this way. Like for Linux, we have Swell, which does this like sort of emulation of this wrapping of the Windows environment. And I can compile it in headless mode, which basically means that none of the UI gets created or anything, and you can still run and do a lot of stuff. So if you wanted to run it from the command line to do a bunch of tasks, you could do that. The UI is pretty much a separate thing, and there's not like a protocol for it talking with other things, but there are conventions of not doing certain things from within the UI and not accessing the UI from anything that's running in an audio thread ever, obviously. We have a bunch of in debug builds, there's a bunch of assertions for if UI code gets called when something is locked, that will flag because that's not good. Things like that.
We have the headless version thing as well, and we don't really make it visible to users. Although I'm trying to think if we actually include a version of it now, because there's a few. There's some like session utilities. I can't remember exactly. Like there's a way to do an export from the command line, for example. So you can do an export without apparently firing up Ardour. And that uses the headless, I should say it uses the headless capability of the program. And then there's a full headless version that you can fire up if you want to control it just from a keyboard or via OSC or from a MIDI control surface or stuff like that. And it that theoretically could have come in handy because we had this WebSocket support for Ardour as well now, which we haven't advertised much. And I don't know what will happen. I had great hopes for this when somebody started working on it, and I think I've become a lot more sanguine about it.
So what's the WebSocket support?
Well, it's basically just using WebSockets as a transport for OSC. And so this guy cooked up. It's amazing how difficult it is to find good wrappers for WebSockets if you want to work in them not from the web. You'd think there would just be lib WebSockets, and you open a socket in it just as if it was a regular socket call in POSIX or something. But none of that stuff really seemed to exist in the way that I would have expected it to. Everything was much more higher level. You had to be much more aware of the fact that, this is a special thing called a WebSocket. It's not just like a byte stream that you can dump things down and that sort of. Anyway, somebody stepped in and cooked up the code part of that, and that interfaces with our existing OSC support. And then he did some, sort of, I guess, what would you call them? Mock-ups? I don't know. Some demonstration web pages. And so you point your web browser at Ardour's tiny little internal web server, and it gives you back a web page. And now the web page is sending OSC back to Ardour to control it. And, some years ago, I did a few talks at some conferences in Europe saying, I was really excited about this because I thought it would open us up to the hordes of, web-centric developers out there. And I think it's entirely possible that the reason it hasn't happened is because we haven't even advertised it really to any extent to anyone, because the person who was working on it, I think at this point still considers it a little experimental. But I've really swung around now to the feeling of like, it's not going to make any difference at all. 3 people might come up with it.
We have a web interface that is just for remote control. It doesn't use WebSockets or OSC. It just uses, it's just a web server, and then you can have AJAX requests that, run actions or get status of things and that sort of thing. But it's pretty handy for like, when you're across the studio and you want to start recording, that sort of thing. And you can use it to adjust mixes and stuff, monitoring mixes. But the total number of pages that people have made, I mean, we made a few, and then there's probably a few more, and that's probably about it. Like, there's only a handful of things people want to do, and then once you do that, it's like, okay.
Yeah, it's done. I mean, I felt it was partly a way of putting off. I mean, again, when I was collaborating with the Waves guys, they were talking a lot about, some glorious future when we would all run DAWs in the browser. And I was sort of like, that's not going to happen.
So when we have multi-threading in the browser, then let's revisit that conversation. I guess there is now, actually. So, no.
Well, I mean, I'm about to say when you could just compile a DAW down to WebAssembler, but it wouldn't completely surprise me if you might be able to do that already. I'm not sure. It's a little terrifying in some respects, the direction that stuff's going, because I think that the obvious technical impediments to doing what people think they want are vanishing. But the problem is that it's not addressing the inobvious impediments. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, there is multi-threading, and you can compile things down to WebAssembly, but while there is like multi-processing and threading or whatever, it's not like you can just port a multi-threaded application to that and then run it. Like it's I think it's much more structured than that.
Yeah. I mean, when I think about what might happen with that direction, and I think about the web audio APIs. I think what's going to happen is not so much people are going to port things, but people are going to write more and more interesting toys that get more and more sophisticated in terms of what they can do. and it will close the gap on native DAWs and native audio environments. And the gap won't ever get to be zero. But I think it's probably going to, am I really worried? I don't know if I sound worried. I have a sense that the gap is going to get pretty small, you know?
The thing is, I wouldn't be worried. I'd be excited by that. Like the fact that the toys are going to get sophisticated enough to produce interesting content and give people another creative tool. That's cool.
That part is definitely cool and interesting. But what I worry about is always that, 20 years of listening, to people saying, but why can't you just do this? And imagining that projected onto a web audio ecosystem. And people saying I don't understand, you can do this in live, or, FL Studio can do this. Why can't this web thing do that? And trying to explain, well, because it's in a browser and there's things you can't do in the browser. I don't understand. I can do all this other stuff. Look, it's so cool. It's awesome. So why doesn't it do this? Well, because it can't.
Well, I think the correct response there is, I don't know. I'm not a web person. Desktop software. It's not my problem.
Yeah. Well, I mean, after my dalliance with web stuff, it's been hard to shake it off, even though that was 26 years ago or something.
What's your past? I can tell you mine, but I think you already probably know it.
I was the second employee at Amazon.
Okay.
So, that whole, and that was at a point where, there wasn't really a web ecosystem to speak of. I mean, we wrote early versions of Amazon in C++, because there weren't other tools that you could use to do what was needed. You wouldn't do that today, I don't think. But yeah, I mean, I didn't spend very long. I had left after 14 months, so I wasn't there for very long. But and the reason I was there was I had been the web guy at the University of Washington's computer science department just before that, and so I'd been very involved in the extremely early web and those technologies and stuff like that. So when people talk about what you can and can't do on the web today, I don't feel any personal responsibility for it whatsoever, but I still feel somehow compelled to just sort of say, because you can't do that in a web browser. Because that's absurd. Why do you want to do that in a web browser? Yeah. So that was
fair enough. It's nice, though, that we can go to archive.org these days and emulate classic systems and all in the web browser, too.
Yeah. And it's interesting, at least I don't think it represents much of a movement, but I waste far too much of my time on Hacker News. And it's interesting to see this little, I don't know what to call it, sub-bubble of people who are trying to push people to go back to, drop all this fancy web technology stuff. That it's ruining the web and it's ruining the experience, and it doesn't really let you do stuff much better than you could before. I'm not even sure I agree with them. It's just interesting to see that kind of debate emerging in that particular sort of development ecosystem. And there is sort of a bit of a debate about where things are there and where have all the toys and tricks that they developed over the last 10 years, where's it really taken them to? And is it a good place? Is it a bad place? What should we throw away? What should we keep? I don't want to participate in that discussion much, but it's interesting to watch it from the outside. I mean, even just stuff like GUI toolkits that we were talking about a little while ago. I mean, you look at the equivalent of that in the web context, and it's just a complete shit pile. I mean, they don't have any equivalent to toolkits of any sort, really. Just large piles of, somewhat coherent JavaScript floating around that does something useful. But if you decide you don't want to use that somewhat coherent pile of JavaScript and you move to some other one, everything you learned from the first one doesn't apply in the other one. So it sort of keeps me a little entertained to watch people grappling with all this.
Do you do much JavaScript programming or any?
No, I try to avoid. I mean, occasionally there's something on our website that I have to tweak, but
yeah. I actually really like it. I think it's fun. It's a cool language, not with its own quirks, but every time I do write any, I actually have I enjoy it. But I don't use like any big libraries to do things. I just end up writing stuff. But it's got some really good features, and
yeah, and I feel it's been subject to a lot of positive evolutionary pressure for quite a while.
Yeah.
I think JavaScript 10 years ago was pretty much a stinking pile of crap, but I think it's not anymore. But because so many people have been using it, and there's been a lot of pressure on it to evolve. But instead of evolving in 1985, it's been evolving in the 2010s or something, and
you can write JavaScript that would run on a 10-year-old browser and it'd be pretty nice.
Yeah, no, I mean, but I think that, again, that's what I mean by the evolutionary pressure. They've kept a lot of good backward compatibility. They've introduced new syntax forms. They've got new basic structures. It's just evolved in a very positive kind of way.
I guess what it is like, I feel like you can write, just like you can write completely awful C++, or you can write some like pretty decent C++. I think the same sort of thing applies to JavaScript.
Yeah.
For me, at least.
The only thing that I find is a little weird about it on the odd occasion that I've done anything, beyond, I don't know, something like a one-line trivial thing, is the sense that you're not in control of the event loop anymore. And that's the part of using it that ends up feeling a little unusual. And it's a good thing in some senses, because I think it's good to challenge yourself with different kinds of programming context or something. But there is no event loop anymore that you're in charge of or have any control over really at all. Stuff is just going to happen.
But that's sort of the life of a desktop application developer anyway. Like, there is an event loop, but is it something you should really be messing with? I don't know.
No, you absolutely should be messing with it.
So you want to avoid messing with it because it's something that shouldn't be.
But I think it's a lot more visible, and if you do need to intervene in it. So we have an example in Ardour now at this point where it's extremely important that some of our threads that run event loops pick up update a thread local storage value before they process any events. And, I don't do that by rewriting the event loop code. There's an API to make sure that happens. But it's because the event loop is actually a thing. It's an object. It has an API, and you can manipulate it and do things to it. Whereas in the web context, the event loop is supposed to be invisible. Like, it's not out. You shouldn't be thinking about the event loop. Stuff will happen when it happens. What programming tools do you like to use?
Mostly Vim and Make. Yeah.
Is there anything out there that occasionally tempts you, but you resist?
Not really. I have things I want, but I don't know how to get them. Like, I want to be able to tell the compiler to warn me when, like, some, regular expression happens, like a cast from double to unsigned int. That would be a great warning. Why don't we have warnings for things like that? Or, just very, a granular, or just to be able to grep code for things like that, or for like, if a variable named this or of this type has some value set to it after a case of some numeric value, like that. If I could search for things like that, that would be so cool. But no one has that.
That's a very long-standing thing. I remember when I was working at University of Washington in the first half of the 90s, I had this dream of creating something that would essentially be like it would be a C language parser, but for every level of expression that was in the parser, like from a statement all the way down to variable name or closing semicolon or stuff like that, it would be like awk. Actually, that was the model I had in my head, was like awk. But in awk, whereas the left side of awk are regular expressions and you have actions on the right, the left side would be sort of syntactical descriptions of things. And you could then run it, you could run your code through it, and every time it found something that matched this syntactical description of something, it would carry out the action on the right-hand side. But I had never built it. I sort of knew how to build it, but it was never quite compelling enough to put the time into creating. You've been a happy Vim user since forever?
Yeah, I mean, I'll use whatever I have around, but I paid the price of beeping the console on some SGI 30 years ago or whatever, learning to use VI, so I've sort of felt invested in it ever since. But what do you use?
I'm an Emacs user. Robin's a Vim user, so
yeah.
And we very happily just.
This conversation was going so well too, I thought.
Yeah, the only area where the difference with things gets to be an issue between Robin and I, him being a Vim user, is just managing white space is sometimes slightly harder than it should be. I think we mostly have things set up now so that it's never much of a problem. But it was slightly harder to get Emacs to do the right thing. Let's put it that way. Which is a little surprising in a way, given, its penchant for infinite customization. But when you use tabs for indentation and then spaces for alignment, to actually get Emacs to do that exactly the way you intend all the time is it's a little trickier than it probably should be. Whereas with Vim, it just does the right stuff, and it's not a problem. How about build systems? Do you just use Make?
On Linux, yeah, but then on Windows and Mac, we have projects for each, for Visual Studio and
does having multiple different build systems or per platform build system bother you at all, or it's fine?
Yeah, it bothers me, but not enough to actually change it. So. And, most of the times we update the projects just using text editors anyway. So, I mean, I guess not Xcode projects as much, but the Visual Studio ones, yeah. But, yeah, it's just, it's not ideal, but it works. You end up short term, you'll avoid creating new files for things and stuff like that, and then eventually you do it anyway. But you just put stuff like that off too.
Yeah, I mean, we've been through 3 cross-platform build systems, I guess, and I guess the one we have now is it does everything that we want. We use WAF. It has one very important property, which is important because we got burned in the past. We started using auto tools and autoconf, and that was just a nightmare. And I would never go back to that. And if anyone said to me that they thought they were really good tools, I would just probably not want to collaborate with them in any way. The principal problem was that, those tools require that every person who uses them has the same, pretty much they have to have exactly the same version. So if you've got one person working on a software who has autoconf n.s and the other person has autoconf n.t, there's a pretty good chance that stuff isn't going to work. And that was just untenable for, a kind of a distributed open source development environment. And then we moved on to sconf, which is written in Python, which is nice. And it had several nice properties to it, but it's really slow at figuring out what needs to be built. And because when you're doing development, you're almost, I don't know about you, but I would guess you're always doing incremental builds, not full builds most of the time. That penalty was just too high. And the thing about WAF that's great is that you include WAF with the project. It's the actual build system. It's sort of like you included the make program inside of Reaper. It's written in Python. and it's not very big. And it comes it comes compressed, and when you unpack it, it still isn't really very big. And the only thing that's a little strange about it is that it's, it's written in Python, but the things you write as your build descriptions are not really quite like a Python program. Like if you went into it thinking, oh, I'll just read this thing because it's Python, and I read Python and I'll see how they do the build, you wouldn't understand how the build is done.
It's data, not.
Yeah, exactly. And I sometimes find that a little bit unnerving, that because I don't have to go back to those files very often. I mean, adding a source file is just you stick a line in there somewhere with the file name. So you don't really have to go back and look at it very often to understand how it works. And when I do, I'm something like, wait, how does this work again? It's hard to keep the model of WAF in. I find it hard to keep the model of WAF in my head unless I'm in it, actually working on something to do with the build, which happens very, very rarely now. But as I said, it's great. It runs across all the platforms that we build on, and everybody who builds gets the version with the source code. So there's no problem of, oh, you've got a newer version of WAF or an older version of WAF. I've been looking at Meson and Ninja, which I guess are sort of everybody's pointing to as the next generation build systems. And I like them. They seem really great. If I could click my fingers and just, all of Ardour's build scripts would be converted over, I would probably do it. But alas, that doesn't seem to be a magic trick that I can perform.
That's not exactly a good testament. I mean, it's like, well, if it was just instant and free,
Well, no. What I mean by that is, I've done a couple of little small,
it seems
side
to work
projects
well,
using
is what
it.
you're saying.
Everything seems to work well. It's very nice syntax. It has a bunch of things built into them, that WAF didn't have initially. So, like, we had to write our own internationalization build stuff.
I guess what I'm saying is, if I could snap my fingers and turn us into some unified build system that was built correct builds identical to the existing ones, I would do that too. It doesn't matter what it is. But the fact is, it would be a bunch of work, and there would be a bunch of testing, and there would be things that are wrong, and
I think it does matter. I think it does matter what it is, though. Like WAF, we already have something that actually ticks every box, right? There's nothing missing. It's cross-platform, blah, 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 blah. It does everything we need. So it's not like we would do this as a way to get something new. It's more a case of, when I look at the things I've tried with Meson, it actually it feels better than even with WAF. Like, it feels like my build scripts are more comprehensible, and I'm just using a tool where they just got everything right, whereas WAF got 98% of things right.
Well, 98's pretty good, yeah.
98's pretty good, and that's why, as I said, unless I could snap my fingers, there's no real reason to move. But I don't know. Perhaps at some point something will change on one of the platforms that becomes hard to get WAF to follow. And because Meson has a lot more people using it, Meson will already do it. And at that point, maybe we'll make the switch. But one of the things that I don't really have a firm position on, but having been doing this stuff for about 21 years now, and looking at the DAWs and how they've evolved over that period of time, I'm unsure whether there's a commodification and convergence going on, or something else, or nothing at all. And I wonder what your perspective is on that.
Commodization, is that what you said? Commodification and convergence?
A commodification. Yeah, in the sense that they become interchangeable. Obviously people get used to one of them, but in terms of functionality and what you can do with them, they're all converging down on the same set of features.
Right.
And essentially they become a commodity rather than...
I don't know. What else falls into that category? Our browsers, our operating systems. Because a browser is interchangeable. You can browse the same websites.
Compilers would be more or less.
Yeah, but like, I guess on in terms of DAWs, you're not going to have. I mean, you can import the same media, but like, there's not, and there are converters to convert project files. But in general, man, I'm gonna go with it's. They're still a little different in that, that you're not gonna. It would be a very, very big project to switch from one to another, assuming you want to be able to work with the same projects that you have. But then again, it depends on what you're using it for, because if you're, constantly making new things and you don't care about your existing projects, then I guess it doesn't really matter. So, I don't know.
I guess the question also looks a little different if you're looking at somebody who's starting out for the first time as well. Like, you could rephrase the question of, will it make any difference whether I pick Reaper or Logic?
Yeah, I mean, will it make a difference? Of course, it always makes a difference. But, is it going to change someone from being someone who, is it going to make their podcast famous one way or another? No. Is it going to make their music catchy? No. So I don't think it really matters. So, I mean, I guess it's really comes down to that, it's not a commodity. It's more of it is and it isn't, in that it's about being a tool that people use. So, people are going to choose different tools based on how they function and stuff like that. But ultimately, any of them can make the thing that they need to make. It's just a matter of how they want to go about doing it or something.
That's a very software-centric view of tools, though, because for most other tools, if you need a hammer, you can grab more or less any hammer.
Right, but what about like a 3D printer or some tool that's
stuff
more? I mean, there are different kinds of hammers. Sure, have you tried nailing
or a sledgehammer? Right. Doing finished trim. No, it is true that there are distinctions there, but I think that's a useful way, in some respects, to think about. Well, it could potentially be an interesting way to think about the differences between DAWs, but I think in practice, that kind of distinction really isn't. Like, Reaper isn't the sledgehammer to Logic's finished trim hammer, right? That's not the right kind of analogy at all.
Right. No, but I guess it's different people have different needs in terms of what they want to do, and the people doing sound design for video games have different needs, and I think Reaper probably is the best, gives them so many options of how to do a lot of these sort of batch things and scriptable things that makes it suited for that. And so, is it a commodity? I still think it's something that's much more. It's just so much more. The details of it are so much important that where you don't, in a commodity, you don't care. Like, an orange is an orange. What the specifics of it make the specifics of a given orange are an orange. My analogy is breaking down because I'm just saying it's not. I'm going wholeheartedly. It's not a commodity. Okay, so just because it's all about the details, and commodity is not about detail. Commodity is like, it's a DAW, it's a DAW. It doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter which toothpaste you buy.
So given that,
right?
Why do you think that that most DAWs stress? Maybe stress is too strong a point. I mean, you just gave a good example of a particular type of workflow that you think is probably better in Reaper than in most or all other DAWs. I'm assuming that, it wouldn't be that hard to pick things out from other DAWs that you think are perhaps better than they are in Reaper.
I wouldn't really know because I don't use any of their DAWs, but as someone could, I'm sure someone could point to some blah, blah, blah. Yes, sure, absolutely.
To sort of flip the question around, why is there not a convergence? Why are all these different DAWs continuing to focus on slightly different things and slightly different workflows? why are they not all converging down on exactly the same set of features?
Do you have an opinion on this, by the way?
I don't have a firm answer. I think some of it goes back to why are there so many in the first place, and I think the answer is it's just too much fun to write these things. I don't see people dashing out to write new text editors much, right? I mean, yeah, there's a few floating around, but in terms of commercially successful text editors, it doesn't seem like a big growth area. Browsers, I mean, to some extent, they've gotten too big and too complicated, but there's something about writing software that works with audio that there's a certain, maybe it's just a certain type of people, but there's a lot of us that it is just a massive positive feedback loop. And I think maybe the nature of that feedback loop and the way it sort of reinforces and is reinforced by our own personal ideas about what we want to do and how the best way to do things, about the kinds of things that are important and the kinds of things that maybe are not so important, that keeps them apart. I mean,
I think there's another actual key element, which is that ultimately these tools are creative tools. And so I don't think, a text editor can be a creative tool, but I mean, you also can use it just to edit configuration files, and, it doesn't have the same level of involvement with the creative process that these tools do. And so I think that anytime that you're making a tool that's used for creativity, there's going to be a lot of stuff there's no right way. There's no convergence necessarily. There's just a lot of different ways of enabling the same sort of capabilities. So you might have common capabilities among all these software, but the way they go about doing that is going to be very different, because ultimately there's no right way, there's no correct way, there's no best way, there's just different ways.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Although I think it doesn't cover the areas where there isn't so much overlap. And again, I think your explanation still covers that in some ways. I'm thinking of, for example, FL Studio. And again, I'm not a user of these things, but I do watch videos about, their workflows and how the tools work. I mean, FL Studio just has a completely different notion, really, of what the creative process that it's fostering or enabling really is. And I don't really see any other DAWs rushing to join FL Studio's model of the world. I'm just happy to leave FL Studio doing what it's doing. And if you're a user who really likes that kind of workflow, then FL Studio is going to be a fantastic tool for you. There's other things that are in a bit more of a gray zone. So until relatively recently, Ableton Live was the only thing that did clip launching in the way that they do. And then the Bitwig guys split off and obviously re-implemented that because it's such an integral part of what they were doing. And then we've then seen Digital Performer and Logic pick it up as well. It's not exactly the same in all those things. There's some differences in how it works and what you can do with it. But that's kind of a feature where I feel like the people building DAWs their approach is different than they are when they look at FL Studio, which is, well, we don't do things that way at all. With the clip launching stuff, more DAWs are saying, maybe there's some way we could integrate this into what we do already. And at the other end of the spectrum, there's, red recording buttons, right, which everybody has. And there's regions that you can drag around. So there seems to be kind of a spectrum of, what is considered to be what's appropriate for the DAWs to do differently and be wild and crazy about, and what are the things that they should be more following sort of the same kind of thing on. And then there's this zone in the middle where it's not really clear how much people should be doing the same kinds of things or not. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I would see there as being a range of levels to which there's a sense we should do similar things to each other. Some things it feels like there's a lot of pressure from users to do things in a very similar way. And some things we're left to do whatever the hell we feel like.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the process, I'm sure for you as well, is, you know, when people want something, is figuring out a way that it makes sense within the context of the software that you're making. And so sometimes people will request things, and then you think about it and you're like, well, yeah, but no, like maybe it needs to be done a little bit differently than that. And, or maybe there's some more general case, or maybe there's some more specific way that it applies in that context.
Yeah, I mean, I think to speak to sort of a very much a current ongoing thing in my development work at the moment, as I mentioned earlier, we're adding, you know, live style clip launching to Ardour at the moment. You know, it's causing us to do a deep dive into what live does with it. I was joking with somebody the other day and saying I think there's probably only 8 people who've really examined this in more detail, or this much detail, and they work for Bitwig, Digital Performer, and Logic. And it brings up this sort of interesting question whenever you're looking at another DAW. I mean, it applies to all software really, but I guess DAWs are the focus mostly for the two of us at least. Like when I look at how live is doing clip launching, when you do this deep dive into it, you find all these odd inconsistencies and things that don't really seem quite right. They certainly don't seem consistent, and some of them don't seem correct. And it throws up this question of, you know, well, did they end up this way because they've got 10, 15, 20 years of experience, and even though you think this is the wrong way to do it, they've actually been out in the field and they know that even though this seems a little weird, this is actually more useful to people.
The question is, if you changed it, would people notice and be appalled?
And or would a person who'd never used live and used a completely consistent version of this stuff go back to live and say, what the hell? You know, I suspect Reaper's no different than Ardour in the sense that it represents a ton of technical debt in the sense that, you know, you made decisions early on that sometimes difficult to unwind completely. Features that work a certain way just because that's what you did 10 years ago. And I don't know how much that applies, you know, across the board. I mean, it obviously doesn't apply to everything because we do change things and we do redesign them and re-implement them. But in looking at live clip launching stuff, for example, how many of these features are just because that's how it turned out? Nobody ever really planned for this feature to interact with that feature and to create a kind of gray zone of a behavior. Or how much is this really intentional? And of course, you know, the only way to find out is actually to ask the people who did it. But
well, and their memory of it may not be correct too. I mean, the bigger term that we use is feature latching or feature ratchet, which is, you know, like once you add something and it's out in the wild for a certain amount of time, then it's like, okay, now you're stuck with that. And you know, you can't, most things you can't remove. You know, if you change, if there are quirks to it, changing it will upset a certain section of your usership, you know? So, that's a bigger factor. Pure technical debt is like, oh, well, that you can repay it, and it's, you know, it takes time. It's not that big of a deal. But I think the bigger thing is the stuff that does affect people, and then you're like, oh, this isn't right, and then you change it, and they're like, hey, I've been using this for years, and it's what happened.
Do you find does that actually act as a brake on some of the decisions that you make?
No, but it's definitely, I mean, maybe, I guess, if they're just genuine quirks where you're like, oh, let's change this, I think we tend to try changing it and see what happens. Yeah, the bigger thing is, you know, the things that are just not ideal and that you live with, and then you figure out a way to update it and then go through the very long process of making sure that people aren't going to be negatively impacted by that, and possibly adding quirk settings for old projects if people want them and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'd say the most obvious example of something like where we did that in Ardour, and we did knowingly sort of completely break old stuff, was when we totally changed how we do crossfades. In fact, really how we even think about crossfades, like what a crossfade actually is. And I guess that was somewhere around maybe version 3 or 4. I think we changed that. Maybe it was a little later, but it was a very fundamental change. And, there were things that you could do before that you just cannot do anymore, at least not with any degree of ease. And I was kind of upset about having to do that, but it was a strange feeling. I was very upset about having to make that level of change, combined with the fact that the only reason we were doing it was clear that the new method was just so much better and was so much more correct than what we had been doing, and so much more useful to so many more people. And it was sort of one of these things where, there's going to be 5 people who did things that were relying on that kind of behavior, but everybody else would have been scratching their head a lot of the time and saying, well, why did it do that? We used to have this thing where if you overlap 2 regions, I don't think, you don't have overlapped regions in Reaper, right?
Regions being items that have audio files in the clips. Yeah. We do you can have overlaps. Yeah.
You can have overlaps. Okay. So, we never used to overlap to it, and we used to create a crossfade that spanned the overlap. And if you change the overlap, it would change the crossfade automatically. And we just completely moved away from that model. And that just totally, anybody that had an older session, the answer was, well, you need to use the old version of the program. Because we're not this is not like a tweak. This is a fundamental transformation of what these things are. And I wasn't thrilled about doing that, but every once in a while something shows up where it seems as though that's worth doing. It also helps that because we're open source, in some theoretical sense at least, it's pretty trivial to tell somebody, well, you should just use the older version because it's always available. Because in practice that's not necessarily the case.
We make all our old versions available too, but we try to avoid those situations. And to the extent, I'm trying to think of anything that we've removed that actually would affect the way a project is played back, and it's pretty tough to come up with one. At one point maybe it was last year, I had a lot of time, so I updated the way PDC, delay compensation is applied. Previously, it was so that if you had two plugins that introduced one sample each of delay, it would add 2 blocks of delay total rather than 1 block, that sort of thing. So basically, completely overhauled and made a lot less ugly the code for managing all of that. But we still have the old mode as an option, because it does affect the way automation is applied and the amount of silence that gets piped through a plugin. So in theory, it could affect things. In reality, I think rarely does. But
and you apparently must feel fairly strongly that it's much better to do that than simply rely on the fact the old version's available.
Yeah. I think it's nice knowing that we can load old projects and play them back, as closely as possible. Obviously things will change, and some things are unavoidable, but yeah, I feel better about that. And the way that the new code works is it's actually a completely new implementation of the old mode, and it shares a lot of the same. Very little logic is added. It's just a matter of when certain objects get applied and that sort of thing. And then now we're doing per FX and or per FX chain oversampling. But the nice thing is that all that work that was done a year ago, that was done. Now it makes it just so much easier to do this sort of thing, which is very satisfying. Because that was that was such a pain in the ass a year ago. But now it's like, all right, this is the environment I want to be working in. That me of 15 years ago was an idiot. Can't believe he got me this far. But yeah.
Well, I mean, for our latency compensation, I mean, I put off all the difficult stuff. I mean, Ardour for years had no bus latency compensation at all. And Robin actually got his PhD thesis out of it. His PhD is on latency compensation in digital audio. And so he sort of did a combination of doing the PhD thesis and doing the implementation, and then sort of redid the implementation afterwards. I'm very glad that he stepped up to do that, because I I don't think I can imagine a world in which I would have been willing to take that on. It's just, I don't know, there's certain kinds of code that after a long time you recognize as like, this is just not my thing. Like I could probably do it, but I will not find it easy. I will never get into a flow state doing this. I will never, it will never suddenly congeal into some beautiful picture. It will always be just an endless struggle against what I have and where I think I'm trying to get to and where I should really be going. And so it was really great to have, somebody else step in who I think Robin really has that picture in his head the whole time, he understands it. He's inside of it. If it needs adjusting for various reasons, or even if a question comes up, like occasionally, it's not terribly difficult to create scenarios where the latency compensation system we have will do something that maybe for some users will seem slightly weird. And Robin can instantly explain, why that is. And I could not explain it at all. I mean, I have really no understanding of how any of that stuff is working. Which is, in a way, a good place to be. I don't know. Do you and Schwa actually overlap on code, or do you mostly have your own chunks of stuff that you are responsible for?
We definitely overlap, but there are definitely areas where I'll start digging in something and then I'll be like, hey, you want to look at that? That sort of thing, where there's the person who has a better understanding of a particular area is better equipped to deal with it. Yeah, we actually have this thing where we our model for releases is we have like a main branch that's like the current release, and then like obvious fixes and improvements will go there, and then we'll have like feature branches and that sort of thing, or big overhaul branches or whatever. But generally, the sort of feature branches are ones where one of us will have started it and have done most of the work on it. And so it's it'll end up being my branch or your branch or that sort of thing. But without the ownership, it's more the responsibility of the branch than the ownership of the branch. But
no, we use an almost identical model. In fact, I would go so far as to say that those feature branches are always the responsibility of one person. Not really because there's a policy on that, but it's just the way it turns out.
Yeah. One person's got the big picture of that branch in their mind. And so, that's...
And very occasionally there'll be some scenario where you'll ask for input and say, like, I think this is going the right direction, but can you have a look at it and just see what you think? Almost more like code review than...
Or what do you think about this change? Is this a problem?
Yeah.
That sort of thing, yeah.
Of course, the craziest development pathway that I've had with Ardour so far has been this work on time representation, which has now been consisted of two major efforts, both of which took about 18 months. And I threw the first one away and then redid it all. And that involved having a feature branch that ended up, I can't even remember. I mean, it basically touched a huge number of files and was tens and thousands of lines of code changes. And I had to keep rebasing that all the way through 18 months. And it's in master now, and it's functioning reasonably okay. There's some glitches in there, but that was a very unusual type of a scenario where there was something that simply was going to take so long to to actually implement, to design and implement and do even some basic testing on it. There was no way that it could have happened much faster than that. And so it was inevitably going to be sitting out there in this feature branch. And every once in a while there would be a somewhat hairy rebase. But do you use git re?
I have,
so.
but I try to avoid situations where I even need it. That's the bigger thing. Yeah, totally.
I mean, well, I didn't discover git re. It's really not, you don't even really use it. It's just a thing you turn on.
It automatically resolves your conflicts for you, yes.
It doesn't resolve them, but it remembers.
Well, it remembers the resolution to them, right?
It remembers the resolution, right. And so when you're rebasing for 18 months, that was just completely invaluable, but because there would have been these conflicts that, that I solved 8 months ago that I don't remember what the solution was. Oh, good. It's all taken care of. That was a totally mind-blowing tool discovery for me, because before that, I'd never done anything as big as that particular feature branch, but, it'd be like, I thought I resolved this before. Why do I have to do this again? And then somebody said, git re, and I'm like, what does that do? And why did anyone come up with such a stupid name? But it's a total godsend in that type of a scenario.
I mean, ultimately, Git is just such a joy to have. I mean, yeah. Talk about life changing.
It also feels almost limitless in terms of depth. Like, I feel I know Git reasonably well, but I think in reality I know maybe 5 to 10% of it. There's so many things that you can do with it. I remember when I worked with Waves, we ran into some developer level conflicts there, in terms of, how do you, actually, I guess a really high level conflict, how do you create GUIs? And I guess they had hired some people who were really into the idea that the GUI should be definable by an artist, essentially. It shouldn't involve code, and you should just be able to you should be able to redo the GUI without touching the code at all. And that's very, very much at odds with Ardor's way. And as a result of this, we had to come up with all kinds of strategies for how to deal with commits that involve both the GUI and the library. And we now have a rule in Ardour that you cannot commit in that way ever. Like, you can't do commits that touch the GUI and the back end at the same time. But for a while, when I worked with Waves, we were doing that. And then at some later point, I had to split all those commits apart. It was like, 500 commits that were all tangled up in weird ways. And Git gives you the tools to do that. It was just completely incredible. I think if you'd have gone and talked to somebody who was using Perforce, or still, God knows who would still be using SVN or something, they would have just said, like, well, that's impossible. There's no way that you could ever do that. And yet with Git, you write, like a 50-line shell script or something, and magically everything is teased apart, and your Git histories look exactly the way you wanted them to. It's quite an amazing tool.
Yeah, I agree.
I'd like, if I could, touch on one more thing. Because of this huge feature branch I just mentioned to you that I worked on in Ardour, this is all about time representation in the program and how we represent time. We had run into lots of problems that are caused by doing bidirectional conversions from audio time, measured in samples, to musical time measured in some musical time element like beats or something, and then going back again, or beats to samples back to beats. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit, and you might not want to comment, but about what your approach in Reaper has been to representing these two time domains.
Yeah. I made the decision early on to represent time as in seconds using doubles, which has been an interesting decision. And there are things you have to deal with, rounding and all of the things that happens with floating point numbers. But in general, it seems okay, I'd say. As far as beats and quarter notes go, early on there was the ability to have the sort of project time in beats, and then pretty soon after it was determined that quarter notes were the more the less problematic and the easier way to deal with plugins and interoperability, I guess. And so we represent those also in using doubles. And they, for the most part, I mean, there's a lot of little things you have to get right, but I feel like in general, it hasn't been a huge issue. Maybe there's some heuristics around, like, when you have things that are very close but not exactly the same, especially when you're changing time signatures or changing tempo and that sort of thing. But knock on wood, nothing's going to come up to, make me put egg on my face. But yeah, this seems to be an okay way of dealing with things. Yeah.
So you do still have two time domains. Effectively, you've got seconds, which is in some sense is audio time, and then you've got beat time. Everything
in a project is defined in seconds using doubles. So you have, many digits of precision. And then when you're dealing with, if a plugin needs to know the time in beats, then we have a time map that defines the time signatures, and then a set of routines that convert between them. And then for MIDI, they use those same APIs to determine, and actually MIDI items can force a particular tempo too. So if you have some MIDI that's recorded with a known tempo and you want to, have it ignore the project tempo, you can do that sort of thing too. But yeah, and so they all use the same interface for conversion.
But so are your MIDI notes timed in double seconds, or are they timed in musical time?
Depends where they are, I guess. If you're talking about when they're within a MIDI item, then ultimately they're timed in ticks, which are actually, I guess they're generally timed in ticks, which the number of ticks per quarter note is defined by that item. And then when you play it back, then it gets converted to project time. Well, I guess first it gets converted to samples. And then, it gets converted to ultimately, if when you're playing it back, you produce a block of audio, and then it gets converted to samples at that point, and then it stays in samples until it gets to the plugin or to the MIDI output.
I mean, where we were running into problems was mostly in the editor, and you would have things like, there would be a region, a clip, an item, if you like, that was, say, at the fourth beat, and the person moves it a certain amount, and they're not snapping to the grid, for example, and they move it a certain amount and it ends up somewhere, and then at some later point, maybe they move it back. I can't remember an exact example of where we do this bidirectional thing, but
how does Ardour store the time
in the old world? We certainly had both domains, but we tended to focus more on samples, the audio time stuff. The MIDI events would have been stored in a musical time domain with beats and ticks. But where we were running into problems was there were lots of occasions when we would, for some reason, say, what sample does bar 3, beat 2, tick 5 correspond to? And we come up with a sample number. And then for some later point, we would say, well, what bar, beat, and tick does that correspond to? And you can't do those conversions bidirectionally, losslessly. They won't be accurate. And so I guess the main focus of the new design has been so that things that are supposed to be happening in the musical domain just simply stay there. So if you have something that's at the fourth beat and you move it down by 4 beats, it's at the 8th beat. We never computed the sample at the fourth beat and then added a certain number of samples and then figured out where that put us. We just said, well, it was at 4 beats and you said to move it by 4 beats, so now it's at 8 beats. And so we tried to defer ever converting between domains until the rendering for playout. And it's a little bit too early to tell whether this is really going to fix all of the issues that I was trying to fix with it. But conceptually, I really like the idea that all the manipulations that we do when editing that are meant to be musical, they're guaranteed to stay musical. Like we never compute seconds or samples at all. And that was not true before. So, and we also now, we don't use seconds, but we have switched to a so-called super clock, which ticks at some insane, it's integer, but it ticks at some insane frequency. I can't remember what it is, but, and it, has,
right, independent of sample rate.
It's massive multiple sample rate. It has integer factors all the way up to 21 or something like that. And it means that you can do, integer subdivisions without loss of precision. And that seems to work pretty well, except the weird thing is I thought that would show up all over the code. And, it would be a new thing in the code everywhere. And it's really weird. It just isn't. It's mostly a storage format. So it mostly shows up like when we actually store your session on disk, we say where the clips are. And that happens to now be using this superclock thing. But actually in the code when the program is running, it just doesn't really show up a whole lot. And that's been a big surprise to me. It does mean that we should, in theory, be sample independent the way that you are, since you use seconds. And that was another limitation.
Assuming you're not at some very strange sample rate.
Yes, if you're messing around with weird sample rates, it's not going to work. Which your seconds representation, that doesn't suffer from that, right? You could use any sample rate, and you'd be in.
Right. And we have varispeed, so I guess it actually kind of comes in.
Yeah, we use varispeed, but it doesn't play too much of a role because all of our varispeed happens downstream of everything.
I guess, there's a bunch of housekeeping that needs to be done when you're. I think that we end up doing where when you're advancing by a certain amount of time, and then you occasionally you do say, oh well, we should just snap that to the sample that it corresponds to, and that's sort of a little extra logic, but I think it's pretty minimal in terms of.
I've been curious. I mean, I've heard bits and pieces about how other DAWs, have addressed this kind of stuff, and the double second seems to be Reaper's at least the second one that I know of that is using that, as the basis for certainly for all the audio time stuff.
Doubles really are the best data type. I mean, you have so many 53 bits of precision. It's pretty nice.
Well. 64-bit integer, you've got even more.
Well, yeah, but it's in 64s are nice too.
They are.
N64s are nice too.
Yeah. I hope that I won't come to regret not using seconds. I mean, we had lots of discussions about that, and we knew that some of the DAWs are doing it, and we could see some of the benefits of doing it.
I'm sure using N64s with some big scale.
I mean, functionally, it's almost equivalent, right?
I probably would have done that. I probably would have done that originally, but at the time, it was 32-bit. Everything was 32-bit.
I mean, in some sense, N64 with a large scale factor is, from a formal sense, it's really equivalent.
Yeah, because we're not using the low or the high exponents. It's like all of them are going to be right in the middle of the range anyway. So. Except
for when we try to record the heat death of the universe, which Ardour used to be able to. Before the superclock thing, I used to joke that our timeline was long enough to go to the heat death of the universe because we were just doing N64 samples, and at any conceivable sample rate that would stretch out. It would go out past the death of the sun. At least, but it doesn't even stretch that far anymore.
No, just like years now, just a few years or something.
Yeah, I think my main goal for that is we have a guy who's been very involved in the background in Ardour. He's a super technical dude who does live audio stuff in the UK, and I guess he sort of acts as the benchmark. They want to be able to do 3-day live recordings, for example. without anything wrapping or having to start and stop. And so, we generally make sure that we can do twice what he wants. So we could do like 6 days without anything breaking. And if we can handle that, then that seems like it's kind of done.
Well, this definitely didn't feel like the 3 days that it was. 3 hours that it was. Yeah, no.
Yeah, thanks for turning over this much of your time to have a chat. It was a lot of fun. All right, that was my conversation with Justin Frankel, the lead developer of the digital audio workstation Reaper, which took place in early January 2022. There was a lot more that Justin and I could have talked about, and who knows, perhaps one day we will. No idea who's going to be up next on this series of conversations. If you have ideas for possible people that you think I should talk to, or you have suggestions for the structure and format of these interviews, conversations, chats, please get in touch with me, Paul at linuxaudiosystems.com. And thank you for listening, and see you next time.